Hello and welcome to Pulse, your podcast delving into all things health, innovation, digital and data. Proudly brought to you by Pulse IT News. I'm your host, Louise Shaper.
And I'm your other host, George Margellis.
George, it's a long weekend when we're recording this. Have you had a good one?
It's been a good long weekend and it's been a good couple of weeks leading up to it. It's been hectic as always.
You've been busy. What's happening in aged care? I believe there's a bit of news.
We had a couple of functions and events happening here and a couple of announcements. So our good friends at the Australian Institute of Health Innovation had their 10-year celebration and they managed to attend that. And that was a fascinating session. Our good friend, Professor Jeffrey Braithwaite, ran our hypothetical on what would healthcare look like in 2030. And he had a number of very well-known people on stage, including an ex-health minister.
Okay, what did they come up with?
Well, basically, they gave themselves a very short time frame. What would healthcare look like in 2030? And the common discussion was we're on a digital transformation journey, but we're still not there yet. And while there's a number of major initiatives in play, until we actually get them all coordinated and, as we've said many a times, unless the funding model gets changed, we don't see any major changes, but the environment is there for a game-changing transformation going forward.
Jeffrey always runs fantastic hypotheticals. He's always fun.
Jeffrey does a great job. He does. He was really good. The government's changed the implementation of the Aged Care Act from the 1st of July to the 1st of November. And that's something that we all supported. We've been asking for that extension for quite some time. The challenge is that extension came 28 days before the initial implementation date. So people have been working tirelessly to get that up and running by the 1st of July. They've now been given 4 months leeway. So whilst the change is great, I would ask that next time they give us a little bit more notice before they do that sort of thing. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And understanding there were some political initiatives around that. AWS ran the Executive Leaders Summit here in Sydney, and they actually had a strong health presence there. So they had Teresa Anderson talking about the single digital patient record and its huge implications for New South Wales and also its huge implications for cloud infrastructure. And last, but unfortunately not least, I attended the funeral of a 21-year-old daughter of a friend of mine who suffered a very rare genetic disease called Lafora syndrome. And that's a very rare disease which presents as a form of childhood epilepsy and cognitive decline and is unfortunately universally fatal. But the key thing there is I had a chance to speak with the parents, and I've known them quite a while and I've interacted with them quite a bit over the last couple of years, is the heartbreaking journey to diagnosis. It took them literally over 3 years to come up with that definitive diagnosis. And it came back down to genetic testing. I mean, once they did the full sequence genetic testing, they found the abnormality which caused the disease. Unfortunately, they couldn't do anything about it, but the fact that they went through multiple diagnoses leading up to it. So I think that's something we need to have a better look at, is that use of genetic testing for rare diseases like Lafora and many others.
Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss, George, and how sad, 21 years old.
It was quite a sad funeral. I mean, like I said, it wasn't unexpected. We've been on that journey for a number of years.
Last year, there was going to be legislation up so that if you get genetically tested, it's not mandated to report it to your insurer for life insurance. And I understand that that didn't get up before the election, but it wasn't a lack of political will. It was actually just there was so much legislation. It all had to be drafted and that one just didn't get through. But my understanding is that that is still on the agenda for this year, which can't come soon enough for people like your friends, George.
Absolutely. And there's other things like there's Mackenzie's rule law in New South Wales where they're actually doing pre-early genetic testing for children at high risk and with rare diseases. We've had many discussions around how genetics can play a role in healthcare, and I think we really need to double down on that. Catherine North was one of the guests that Jeffrey Braithwaite had at her event, and she gave a great presentation around the advances in genetic testing.
Oh, well, we will wait and see how the results for that legislation to pass.
And down in sunny Melbourne, what's it been like down there?
Yes, sunny, not so much. But anyway, winter has finally hit. It was delayed, but it is here now. But before it got rainy and cold, a couple of weeks ago, I went out into the world and I had a full body MRI scan, George.
Whoa.
Yeah, I've got a clip to play. So I'll play that, which is just a brief highlight of my trip to get the MRI scan done.
The next stop is Toorak Village.
So I'm very excited. Just got off the tram and heading to Pronovo in South Yarra. Louise, I'm here for Evie at Pronovo.
Thanks for having me. Louise.
Hi, Louise.
It'd be lovely to meet you. I'm going to take you through to the ladies' room.
All right.
So how it works is we need you to change into the scrubs.
Of course.
So any jewellery is also recommended to come off.
Yeah.
And you can leave everything here. And then I'll be meeting you right out the door and I'll take you through.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, so you know this.
Are you comfortable?
Yes, very comfy. Wear scrubs every day.
This is Louise.
It's lovely to meet you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. You're actually patient. Your patient's you right now.
Oh, that's right. Well, just let me know whatever you guys need me to do.
Have you ever done this before?
I have not.
Okay. So just to double check before you go in, I know you've been through it all already, but there's no pacemaker, no defibrillator, no clips, pins, plates, stents, electronic devices for pain relief or anything like that. No EMR or brain surgery.
No.
Yeah, bring them up, please.
So is there a particular order that you do them in for a reason?
Just start from the top and work our way down, all the way down to the bottom.
Okay. Yep.
So the first few ones that you're in there for is just the basic localizer so that we can plan off
Okay.
when you're first moving in and out, and then it goes back up to your brain, and then we do a couple of inches through the brain, then neck, chest, abdomen, pelvis, and then work our way down.
And when I have to hold my breath, there's a few times throughout.
Yeah, that's all that
Is that
happens.
when you're looking at the lungs or abdomen, right?
That's all, yeah, chest, abdomen, sometimes to the pelvis as well.
Yeah.
And then it goes back to your spine.
Yeah. It's such an honour for me to be able to be here at this.
Patient zero.
I'm really thrilled.
Okay.
And do I get a copy of it?
Yeah, so you'll get a link that will come to you that gives you access to the patient app, and the report will be there, and then we'll schedule a follow-up consultation with you with one of the physicians.
Our GP, once the radiologist signs off on it, she'll be given the report and then she'll do a telehealth with you and go through it.
Yeah. All right, leaving the Pronovo clinic now, and what a great experience. I'm on such a high. That was so fascinating, really interesting, and I really look forward to seeing the results of the report. Okay, now for listeners who are unfamiliar, a full body MRI scan is, as the name implies, it's an MRI of the entire body, which is offered in Australia now by a startup company called Pronovo. And the CEO is actually Australian. They've been in the US for a few years and they've recently opened up here in Melbourne and Sydney. George, it was a really fascinating experience. Like the process, it was the most thorough intake form I've ever filled out. No doctor has ever asked me that level of detail about my personal and familial health. Specialist telehealth appointment to ask key follow-up questions of things that I'd mentioned in that form, and then to make sure that I understood the process and, importantly, that I had a really good understanding of what the scan can do, but also what it can't do. The appointment itself, when I went in there, they said, now, do you want to watch a movie or something? So when you're in the MRI, they've got mirrors with a television screen in the background so you can actually watch something. So I was in the MRI scan for 45 minutes. And then a week later, I woke up to an email with the full report available to me, which was, I think it's like 30 pages or something. And it was in my patient portal. And then I had a 40-minute telehealth appointment later that day to go over the results. It was really thorough. And what I found for me personally is, fortunately, there was no big things I need to worry about. There was, of course, some anomalies, which you'd expect in everybody, but nothing to worry about. But I was wondering, George, about whether to talk about it on the pod, only because I do know that the traditional medical establishment isn't a fan of full body MRIs. And the doctors I've spoken to about it, including my GP, she said, well, people are just concerned that, every physical body has anomalies that are nothing to worry about. But there is a concern that people will worry, they'll have unnecessary tests and procedures, and then that'll add to an already stretched health system. But, as we discuss regularly on Pulse, I believe that people should have access to their health information, and there's plenty of research coming out of organisations like Open Notes that show how beneficial it is for individuals to have their information.
45 minutes isn't too bad, because I remember the early days MRIs, even just like knee MRIs, just took 20, 25 to 30 minutes. So it's quite a slow process. And historically, a few decades ago, there was an attempt to do something similar with full body CT scans. Problem, of course, with full body CT scans is that's a heck of a lot of radiation you get in a full body CT scan. So that sort of killed that off, and it didn't have the diagnostic accuracy of MRI. So did you get to keep the photos, the images?
Yes, I got the images and they're not yet, but they will be uploaded to the My Health record as well. Because that was the thing. I was like, you guys better be uploading this. And yes, so they are doing that. They're brand new though. Like it turned out I was patient 0, which I was like, what? Yes. The one thing for me was there is a familial history of cancer going back a couple of generations. And I don't let it worry me a lot, but it's there and it's something I'm aware of. And then also, but the Alzheimer's stuff, which I've discussed before, is, very prominent in my family. And so I was really pleased that there was nothing in my scan to indicate any tumors or anything like that. My brain, I double checked. I said, are you sure my brain's fine? And the brain, absolutely fine, healthy brain. But the good thing is that if in time something does develop for me, I've now got a baseline of what my healthy brain looks like, which will be helpful for the people treating me, but it'll also be helpful, hopefully, for medical research as well.
Absolutely. Look, the idea of having that baseline is great. Like you said, the key here is having an informed patient. And obviously, you're probably a super informed patient, but the fact that they spent that time explaining to you the pros and cons, what it can and can't do is interesting. The intake form, was that an online intake form?
Yeah, it was online. And honestly, there was stuff I had to ring my mum about. It was so in-depth. 2 friends of mine have also gone and had Pronovo scans done. And we've all mentioned how long that intake form is. One of my friends who had it done, very sad situation. She went to visit a friend recently who she hasn't seen for a while. And her friend, who has been sick for a while, traditional medicine didn't know what to do with her. They didn't diagnose anything and they kept saying, you're fine. Here's some more painkillers. Like you've probably just done something, it'll be all right. Anyway, and so she finally, after experiencing a range of symptoms for a while, just insisted on a more in-depth scan. I don't know what she had done. And she's got stage 4 cancer. It's everywhere. It's in her bones. If her friend's cancer had been picked up earlier, and by the way, it's not that it's the fault of doctors. Our health system isn't built around preventative healthcare to try and pick up things early, diagnose early. You mentioned earlier, George, that diagnosis that took years to get.
Look, I mean, there are a number of issues there. Of course, is that statistically the chances of someone that age having a disease are low, and we're trained in that model that, the old saying, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. But the reality is diseases come across a spectrum and people will have diseases earlier or later than others. I think it's important that we have these series of tests. The key thing is that information now travels with you, because in 10 years' time, you may be living somewhere else, and having those baseline scores is important. And we'll be watching with great interest, Louise. I mean, that is the cutting edge of medical technology as we speak today.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The only thing I did want to say that I'm really pleased I had the opportunity, but, most people will not. The cost is extreme. Like we're talking $3,500 in Australia, and most people cannot afford that. I couldn't. They wanted someone to have a patient 0. So I was very happy to volunteer. But what I'm hoping as well is that from an equity standpoint, if people who can afford it get it done and it becomes more commodified, then the price over time can drop. Then a health insurance would cover it. If our health system had different policies set up so that we could do preventative healthcare, whether it's that scan or other things that will be invented, because there really is an important equity issue. And it does concern me that a lot of these new devices and things that are available, and, that's great, but I don't think they should just be for people who can afford it. And most people cannot.
Obviously, market forces will play their role, and MRIs are expensive devices to amortize. But it's interesting, we saw a similar thing years ago with the whole body CTs, but also more recently, there is a thing called the calcium score. So it's a CT score they do for people looking for heart disease, which at the moment isn't subsidized by Medicare, even though it has significant diagnostic value. But we've seen some market forces where, originally when it came out, it was several $100s, and now you can get it done for a lot cheaper because technology's there's a market demand. But I agree with you. I mean, these are sort of things that should be integrated into our universal healthcare system. We keep on talking about, Australia has a great universal healthcare system, but there are so many little gaps and holes in the system that, we're not taking advantage of. And the fact that maybe having done this test at your age provides benefit, in 10 years' time when you present with something and they sort of say, well, we can actually have a look at the original paper and see, if it's been there for 30 years, it ain't going to kill you type thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, well, shall we get started with our hot topics?
Let's go.
Now, we're going to start today with a true story out of China. I say true story because when the internet tells you that China has built the world's first AI agent hospital, the natural reaction at this stage of the AI hype cycle is to call BS, but it's actually true. This is a fully virtual hospital run by 42 AI doctors spanning 21 medical departments. The agentic AI systems are capable of autonomous diagnosis and treatment plans, and they diagnosed over 10,000 cases in just a few days. But, and here's the catch, the patients are also AI. This entirely virtual hospital was described in a paper by researchers at Tsinghua University, which came out last year. But what is new now is that the AI agent hospital is now being rolled out in real life hospitals to real life clinicians and real life patients for clinical training and decision support. George, what I thought was really cool about this is that the AI agent doctors, it's agentic AI, so they taught themselves by interacting with the AI patients. And now those agent doctors, they've passed their training, so to speak, and are now being deployed to potentially help in clinical settings. What did you think about this one?
This is a really interesting story, and you really can't discount the innovation coming out of China, as we saw a few months ago when they launched DeepSeek. And you remember the turmoil then when their AI model came in at 1/100th the cost of the other ones. Do you note that the doctors passed their training? They actually got 93% in the medical exam from the US. What they did, and this is really the exciting part of it, and for the nerds out there, if you really want some deep and meaningful reading, the article they published last year, Agent Hospital, a simulacrum of hospital with evolvable medical agents, as it's called, is a fascinating read on the use of technology in healthcare and this concept of this Med Agent Zero, a method for training AI doctor agents within the agent hospital without manually labeled data, which allowed them to learn from their own experience, was quite a fascinating concept. It moves beyond the classic LLM model to a self-teaching model, which has huge opportunity going forward. The simulacrum term I had never heard before. I had to look up Wikipedia what it means.
I know. I was like, is that a real word?
Yeah, I thought, is that a Chinese combination of a couple of terms together? But no, the Wikipedia tells me it's a real thing. And they describe it as something that's more than a simulation of a scenario, but it simulates an entire environment. I don't know if you're old enough to remember the old sim programs. Oh, gee, it would have been early in this century called Sim Hospital, where you could simulate the running of a hospital and you had little people running around a hospital and you could determine where they went, where resources went. This seems like that on steroids. And theoretically, that sounds like a really good idea. But the classic challenge, of course, as we always see, is taking it from theory to implementing it in the real world. And that's going to be where we get some really interesting stuff. One thing I spoke to some colleagues about this, we sort of said, well, this would be an interesting project to do, but to try and do this sort of thing in Australia, the ethics approval boards would probably take you 5 or 10 years just to get the approval to do it. So I think let's keep an eye on it. I think it's going to be potentially a game changer, whether it's a pure AI hospital or an AI-enabled hospital or an enhanced hospital with AI, whatever they decide to call it in the future. I think this is going to be a chance to demonstrate AI value. And we'll keep an eye on it. Louise, maybe you and I should volunteer to go check it out in real person. I mean, you've had a scan here in Australia. Let's see what the Chinese can do with your health data.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, fascinating stuff. So they're piloting it now in real life scenarios. So we'll keep an eye on that story and report back once more data about its application in real life is going. Over to Australia now for a real-life deployment of a machine learning model at the Royal Melbourne Hospital in Victoria. They've deployed an algorithm to calculate likely waiting times in the emergency department and deployed a public-facing dashboard. I love this story because it is so patient-focused. I'm thinking every hospital with an ED needs to reach out to Royal Melbourne and ask to deploy this in their hospitals. George, what are your thoughts on this one?
This is a great and very required application. Anyone who's experienced the challenges of waiting in a hospital emergency department will know that having some idea about how long you're going to wait there. Do I need to pack a lunch? Do I need to bring supplies? Because have you tried buying something to eat in a hospital emergency department? I think I paid $5 for a Snickers bar last time I was there. So,
oh my God.
And kudos to Dr. Tim Fazio. He's a great up-and-coming clinical informatician. I first had the opportunity to meet him almost a decade ago when you were running the CXI network. He was one of the young and eager doctors who was really interested in how technology worked. And yeah, he's progressed well, and his team at the Royal Melbourne Hospital has done some amazing things. So it's good to see that initial support for clinical informatics has led to outcomes. It was unfortunate that after a year or two, they decided to cut the funding for it, and we haven't been able to continue that progress. But nevertheless, he's answering a question that everyone asks. How long should I expect to wait in ED? And it's not just an algorithm of, there's 30 people in the waiting room, therefore, 3 hours type thing, but they're using real-time data and machine learning. And the key now, of course, is to verify those results. They've got that internal testing model and they continue to use the data they generate to improve the quality. But I do note there was another paper which came out over the last couple of weeks about the virtual front doors in healthcare produced by the team at Health Direct. So interesting to see how those two ideas would work together. So would the virtual front door indicate how long the waiting times are, indicate maybe what better options are, link it in, maybe streamline the process? This idea of, customer experience being optimized. Down here in Sydney, Victor Dominello did a lot of this work in other parts of government, but healthcare hasn't really considered the customer journey model very much. We've seen here with the urgent care clinics and other options, whether they can all work in some way to not only just report waiting times, but improve the waiting times. So we'll see how that works together.
And let me just check. So I'm going to Alt-Tab to my screen and do a refresh. So I'll describe what I'm seeing. I'm on the Royal Melbourne Hospital's wait time in emergency page, and I'll put a link to this page in the show notes so people can check it out. So it is currently 8:36 a.m. and this website was updated at 8:30 a.m. So the data is minutes old. Anyway, apparently if I rock up to the Royal Melbourne Hospital now, my expected wait time is between 1 hour and 28 minutes and 2 hours and 12 minutes. And there's currently 19 patients waiting and 18 patients being treated. And there's a bunch of information here about how they calculate expected wait times, a huge big font notice, please do not avoid seeking care or treatment based on wait times. We're here to help our community. And then what to expect when you arrive at emergency and some other information there. And very, very easy, simple to read. And yes, well done, the entire Clinical Informatics Centre at Royal Melbourne Hospital. As an industry, healthcare industry, we do customer service terribly. And the system's not designed for that. So this is a really big step forward. And the results in the next year, George, when they start publishing, what they experienced, what patients experienced as a result of having this dashboard, it'll be fascinating to see. And maybe Tim can come on the show and talk to us about it.
Key thing here, and you highlighted there, is that they're saying this is not a reason not to attend the emergency department. And again, this is why I thought linking this up with the virtual front door is important, because if you're a level 1 or 2, you're not going to be waiting an hour and a half to 2.5 hours. If you're going in there with crushing chest pain, trust me, I'm sure the Royal Melbourne will get to see you very, very quickly. This is more for people in level 4 and level 5 presentations, which are non-urgent, non-life-threatening type of presentations. So keep in mind that our emergency departments do an amazing job. So this is a first step, I think, in us developing a much more effective and efficient system which uses things like virtual front doors and other services. And we discussed 1-800-Medicare or whatever it's going to be called in the future. But the current funding model still has its challenges here.
It does.
So we need to think about how that's going to work.
All right, they'll sort that out eventually, George. Well, let's go over to the US now. In the previous episode, we talked about the FDA implementing AI to cut down the amount of time it takes for processing applications. It was only a couple of weeks ago, and they said that it was going to be mandated by the end of June. Well, they actually released their AI tool called Elsa just last week, but it only took hours before reports surfaced that it is not working as expected and it is struggling with basic tasks. And this made the news in the US, like the nightly news. George, is this a case of unbridled enthusiasm for cost savings at the expense of basic testing for reliability?
We only spoke about this very recently, so I was very surprised to hear they were implementing it so quickly. But guess nothing could surprise me. How a policy by breathless announcement seems to have some short givings, as we've seen in this case and in a number of other cases. I'm not a programmer, but I will claim my wife is a programmer. A couple of things I have learned from her is that testing is really important when you're implementing a critical system. She did a lot of work in banking and in the finance sector, and she said development time was short. It was the testing that was important. And that old waterfall model of doing things in steps and ticking off the process is pretty important. And unfortunately, it seems the enthusiasm from our tech bro buddies in the United States to get the FDA on board was probably short-sighted and may have forgotten some of the basics of software development. But I think they'll improve it. And the fact that the transparency, they're doing it in such a public way,
That is good. Might not be great PR, but it is good that it's transparent. And they did say they had till the end of June, didn't they? So they've still got some time to sort it out.
They'll probably just blame Elon Musk now, so it's all right. So it's okay.
Oh, poor Elon. Now, speaking of regulatory bodies, in Australia, the TGA have approved a sleep apnea tech on both the Apple and Samsung watches. I am loving this trend of consumer tech achieving medical grade status. Dr. Margellis, on behalf of all the people listening who are about to rush out and buy their partner an Apple or a Samsung watch in the hope of a good night's sleep, can you explain for us how this technology works and will it potentially save marriages?
So, look, Australia is a world leader in sleep apnea research. The idea of CPAP and some of those technologies around sleep apnea, it started off here in Australia. The fact that the TGA is approving them is a big step in that democratization of diagnostics and access to data. Importantly, the watches do not diagnose sleep apnea, but what they do is identify people at risk. And the two devices, the Apple device and the Samsung device, use their own unique algorithms, and it's a combination of their sensors. So they combine accelerometer readings. So they look for small jerks in hand motion during the night, which signify people having this. The Samsung watch now also has oxygen saturation readings. The Apple watches used to have them, but they've taken them off because of some issues there. So there's that. ECG measurements are included now in both these watches, so they look for heart rate changes. And some of them, they even have the capability of listening for snoring sounds. And I think you have to link it up with your phone at the same time, so your phone has to be sitting by. The Apple Watch requires you to do it for 10 days over a 30-day period. The Samsung Watch claims they can do it in 2 days over a 10-day period. And there's some real intricacies to the way this is done. But it looks for those classic signs of sleep apnea, the waking many times during the night, but unconsciously waking. So people don't know that they wake up 10, 20, 30, 40 times an hour.
I know when my dad had the test, they were shocked. And my dad didn't realize, but he's like, oh, that's why I feel like crap. I mean, and this was years ago, just how many times he would wake up in an hour. Like I think in an hour, he was only asleep for 17 minutes or something. It was crazy.
There was a very good article on a CPAP site from the United States, goes into details about how this technology works.
Yeah, we'll put a link, put it in the show notes.
It's a common syndrome. It has definite implications for people's health. And as we've seen with other things like atrial fibrillation checks and fall checks using wearables, there is a definite benefit. We need to weigh those false positive versus false negative things. So again, we're under a evaluation period and this needs to be validated. For old blokes like me and my friends, compared to going for a classic sleep test, which is quite an invasive procedure, using this to identify those people at risk, whether it'll save any marriages, I'm not quite sure. I tend to worry that if you snore too much, the partner may stick their watch down your throat and shut you up. That might be one way of doing it. Don't recommend that as a treatment modality. This is that opportunity to now start using more and more data, especially when that data is in the patient's hands, and the patients can make the decision how they want to use that data and who they want to share it with, and if they want to share it with some other algorithms. And we've seen this where some of the early genetic testing can now be shared with new algorithms. So there's a big opportunity here, and it also gave me an excuse to buy a new Samsung watch.
Oh, very good. So you've had that discussion with Marina. It's research.
It's research. That's right.
Yeah. Cool. I love this. It seemed like such a pipe dream, years ago when we started in this field, George, that you would have consumer tech having medical grade status. So back to our earlier commentary around the MRI scan, for me, I think of these things quite similar. So if that data can be used to benefit and be preventative, pick things up ahead of time, I mean, maybe not in 2030, but I'm confident by 2050, we will look back at now and go, oh my God, that seems so antiquated what you guys were doing in 2025. It'll be much more integrated into everyday life.
One of the key things, of course, is integrating this data into the healthcare system so that clinicians can take advantage of. Should your GP be notified that you're at high risk of sleep apnea and organise the relevant testing around that, have the relevant advice to it. Maybe the Chinese AI hospital will be able to do that better, and that might be an example of how it's done. We don't know where this is going to go, but that continuing innovation, the prevalence of smartwatches. I mean, you don't see too many old-fashioned watches anymore. Everyone seems to have a smartwatch. So it's definitely an opportunity to use that data source for innovation.
Oh, that's right. All right, well, next up, George, I wanted to talk about the state of interoperability and EMRs. Now, our friends in Tasmania have announced a preferred vendor for their statewide EMR, and they've developed some fantastic branding, by the way. It's called the Bluegum Health Transformation Project. So congratulations to the team in Tassie, and for anyone looking for a job in informatics and digital health, make sure you follow the Bluegum team on LinkedIn because they have a lot of things to do over the coming years, so there'll be lots of opportunities there. But on that theme of statewide EMRs, back in the homeland of England, they have recently announced an RFI for a single patient record. And we also see new news stories around proprietary AI being embedded into these proprietary products. So we've got Oracle, they've announced a new AI first EMR. Stanford Medicine just last week, they've built something called Chat EHR into their EMR so that clinicians can interact with the EMR by speaking to it. They can extract data out of it, all again through a verbal conversation with their EMR. And I'm wondering, George, why are we seeing more of this globally, like the move to a single big vendor, when interoperability at a technical level anyway has never been more doable? And I'm wondering, I think failure is probably too strong a word, but is this a failure of the holy grail of interoperability when it comes to decision makers who decide to put all their eggs in one basket when there's so many other things that could be done rather than just pick one ring to rule them all?
Single digital patient records seem to be the flavour of the month. New South Wales announced a big project last year that's been going forward. And it's, whilst some of us in New South Wales are a little sceptical, at the recent AWS summit, they demonstrated that their systems are going forward, again, with a single vendor. Tasmania is jumping aboard and NHS is now following on board. And like I said, when you look at some of the bigger healthcare systems in the United States, they've gone down that single digital patient record system model of a single vendor. First of all, Bluegum, you're right. It's a great Australian name. And we both know that their CCIO, a good friend of ours, is quite outspoken about digital health. But I think there's this constant debate we've been having for decades now between best of breed versus single monolithic systems seems to be tilting back towards that single system model, even though the buzzword now is a single platform. But the reality is it's a single proprietary monolithic system that you have to work within. And at the same time, we've been doing some amazing things with interoperability. The Sparked initiative here in Australia is one of those great examples. The problem is that the procurement people may not quite be aligned with the informatics people, and they're procuring based on what they see as a safe solution. Even though a lot of these EMRs do demonstrate interoperability, you're right that the big challenge here is those sort of embedded technologies like the AI tools, which by stealth basically lock you into that system. So you can go out and say, yes, my EMR is interoperable. However, you can't take advantage of the AI tool unless you get the data into our system. And therefore, that becomes almost a vendor lock-in by stealth. And proprietary infrastructure has been a challenge for years. I remember many, many years ago when the clinical record system was being implemented, they had a very specific hardware requirement that very few vendors could provide, which basically meant they had very little choice in what they could buy their systems from. And that led to some major issues. When the cloud came out and we started moving to a distributed infrastructure model, they had to drastically change their system to meet those requirements because everyone was moving to non-proprietary infrastructure models. So we need to make sure we don't go through that trap again of being locked into systems that we can't adapt to. And then knowing that in 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to want to change our systems. If we're locked down to a single vendor, that really limits our choices.
That's right, yes. And we talked last episode about primary care. So for our overseas listeners, by far the majority of primary care clinicians definitely are digital, especially in GP land, but they use systems that are homegrown here in Australia. So I don't see primary care rushing to leave their software to join up to a big single digital patient record. You said earlier, George, and we've talked about it on the pod before as well, it really should be about interoperating to a platform. So whether it's the EMR, the primary care, that little niche product that does it so well, you want to bring that in, which might be for one department of your hospital or whatever. If they were all interoperable to this platform and data got exchanged through what the UK call the spine, which I think is a great name, then surely that's the model we're all moving towards and that we want, because that's true interoperability then, where your data can really follow you because it's all based on standards.
The cynic in me sort of thinks, okay, if I was running a business which, by making everything interoperable challenges my future revenue, that I might try to tweak in such a way that I don't challenge my future revenue. So there are business concerns here. But, the other thing, of course, is when we talk about a single digital patient record project in New South Wales, we talk about it, but then that's only whilst you're in the New South Wales healthcare hospital system. The 99% of the time that you're not in the system, you have a separate record. And whilst there is talk about linking them, it really is in a single digital patient record because your optometrist has a different record, your physiotherapist has a different record, your GP, if like many Australians, you have a couple of GPs, you may have a couple of GP records, and there's still that fragmentation. Some of that because of the challenges of the way we deliver care. Some of it is because people like GPs have been using their system for many years. It's designed specifically around them, but it was never designed to talk to anyone else because that wasn't how healthcare was delivered back in the days. There's some challenges here. Tasmania's may be a great example. They may be able to work out how to do it. It's a relatively small state. They've got a relatively defined number of clinical services there.
Well, and there's only, just over 500,000 people live in Tasmania. That scale should actually work in their favour.
Absolutely. We so often say when I worked at Intel that, the best place for a clinical trial was Tasmania because you really did have a captive audience to a large degree. When the NBN was first launched, it was first launched in Hobart. So they actually have some very good infrastructure there. Yeah, I'll be watching that with interest. I mean, Bluegum may be become a word of praise in the future. You Bluegummed that, yeah? You did it well, so...
Oh, yes. Okay. And under John Lambert's leadership as, CCIO there in Tasmania, I'm sure they'll achieve some really great things. So we will get him on the show to talk to us about how it's going in the future.
Absolutely.
Well, last up today, OpenAI currently teasing the world, promising AI-first hardware that will result from their $6.5 billion acquisition of Johnny Ive's design firm. Now, we're talking an AI companion that will be with you at all times, listening, seeing, learning, and hopefully helping. I saw this post by Dr. Youssef Abou-Fandi in London, and he proposed that this type of device could act like a junior doctor with expert level and multi-speciality insight, whispering context and guidance, documenting in real time, and helping clinicians make better decisions. He proposed that this type of device could be the most important medical tool since the stethoscope. George, if this type of AI first, all seeing, all hearing, all dancing device comes into play, are the health systems investing hundreds of millions of dollars into the current tech that's available for EMRs? Are they going to be behind the game in a few years if we're looking at a completely different way of capturing and storing information and interacting with it in real time?
All seeing, all hearing, all controlling AI devices can also be a little scary, but that's also a very exciting opportunity. And as you referenced, Johnny Ive was the guy who designed the original iPhones and a lot of the Apple technology. So at the very least, these things will look really cool and will become a status item. So people will want to wear it purely for that reason. But this also links very well with our story about the Chinese AI hospitals. Yeah? The use cases that Dr. Abou-Fandi described are very interesting in theory. However, I might sound a bit like a broken record here, but a broken record for those young people is when things would start repeating because their records skip back. But these ideas need to be tested and validated. I think he does provide some very interesting use cases to enable us to improve quality of care by using AI in a iterative way. And if it improves quality, if it improves safety, it's a good thing. The challenge here, of course, is that the current EMR models won't know how to interact with these sort of tools. So again, we may have hospitals having two competing platforms running their data set. One of the greatest challenges for AI in healthcare has been data acquisition. At the moment, it requires the clinicians to capture the data and enter it. If this can automate part of that and get it into the EMR, and that becomes a couple of interoperability steps that need to be put in place, theoretically, this could lead us to a much more integrated system. The challenge, of course, the data has to be accurate. Now, we have to make sure we validate the data. It needs to be provided with context because just having a whole bunch of data out of context provides issues. We need to know we're not going back to the old garbage in, garbage out analogy where we're importing heaps and heaps of useless data into a system which just effectively confuses it, and that may lead to AI developing more hallucinations or using bad data to make decisions. But it is an opportunity for research. I was particularly impressed with Dr. Aberfundi's LinkedIn post because he did give some really interesting models. And having been involved in medical education, the reality is you learn by experience. So if the tools are playing an active role in training clinicians and helping them think about options, so not necessarily making decisions on their behalf, but providing them with opportunities for decision making that can be evaluated in real time and tested and captured so they can be evaluated from a governance perspective. I think we've got some opportunities. It's interesting if we combine the Chinese digital hospital, the AI tool, the virtual front doors, Tim Fazio's tools around everything. All of these things sort of come together into a complete solution. We just need to think about what that looks like from a patient perspective, but also from a clinician perspective. And ultimately also from a payer's perspective.
Exactly. Yes. Well, what a fascinating time to be alive. And again, we'll reflect back, that podcast we recorded in 2025, like some of that stuff is now every day. We don't even think about it. Other stuff will still seem like science fiction. Lots of really exciting things to work on to invent this new future of healthcare where patients really are at the centre and information is freely flowing and accessible to everyone who needs it. Okay, well, George, it's time for a quick break. And when we return, I'll be speaking with Julia Conway from the Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority about their report on pricing and integrating virtual care into everyday healthcare. We recorded our chat a few weeks ago, and sadly, George, you couldn't join us because that was the day your son decided to go bouldering and you were, I think, in emergency department or an urgent care clinic or something at the time of the interview.
It would have been good to have the feedback at that stage because one thing I did discover is that even though you may have private cover, sometimes the pricing is less than transparent. I'm looking forward to this interview.
Regular listeners to Pulse would know that we talk a lot about the need to change the business models of healthcare in order to deliver on the promise of better healthcare and improved health outcomes. If we keep funding the same things and not providing funding for delivering healthcare differently, we don't progress, or the private market steps in to fill the gaps in innovation in service delivery. Now, given our love of this topic, we were really excited to see Australia's Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority release their final report on virtual care. We have so many questions, primarily around what needs to happen to see virtual care be appropriately costed and funded so that virtual care becomes truly commonplace across Australia's health sector. Joining us today to discuss the report is Julia Conway, Director at the Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority, who leads work across a range of policy areas that underpins the classification, counting, costing and pricing of Australian public hospital services, including virtual care. Julia is passionate about developing pricing and funding incentives that will support the delivery of high-value care. So, Julia, we're on the same page. Now, for listeners who may not be familiar with how IHCPA fits into Australia's healthcare system, what's the role and how are you funded?
We're an independent government agency. We're established by the Commonwealth under the National Health Reform Act and National Health Reform Agreement. Importantly, we're independent from the Australian government and also all of the state and territory governments. And we're governed by a board called the Pricing Authority. They have a role in providing costing and pricing advice on aged care. But in the area of public hospitals, they have determinative powers in relation to the pricing of Australian public hospital services. And our role here is to each year publish the National Efficient Price and National Efficient Cost determinations, which underpin the Australian government's funding contribution to public hospital services. States and territories also make their own contribution as well. IHCPA, as part of doing that, develops and maintains a range of systems that enable the implementation of activity-based funding for public hospitals, including annual patient-level activity and cost data collections, a wide range of patient classification systems, and the Australian Hospital Patient Costing Standards. Together, these systems enable funding to Australian public hospitals to be based on the number and the mix of patients that they care for, incorporating measures of patient complexity and other relevant patient and provider characteristics, as well as keeping up to date with the latest cost data that we have. So it really enables continuous improvement in the way that we fund Australian public hospital services.
Yeah, unless you're involved in actual funding or policy-related decisions, you guys probably fly under the radar a lot, but you're so important. This podcast, we have listeners all around the world in, I don't know, last I checked, about 54 countries or something like that. So thanks for that background. It's good to know that there's this independent body that decides these things. So then when it comes to virtual care, you haven't done a report that specifically focuses on this type of delivering healthcare differently via different modalities, in this case virtual. So why did you guys undertake this virtual care project, and what was the gap that you wanted to make this report a priority?
The use of virtual care modalities has been a feature of the health system for a long time, even, back to Royal Flying Doctor Service using radios for rural areas. Our classifications and pricing models have already enabled the use of telehealth. But I'm sure, as many of your listeners would be aware, there was a big uplift in the use of virtual care modalities with the COVID-19 pandemic. On top of that, there's also been a range of technological advances which are enabling the opportunities to deliver high quality virtual care, and also policymakers trying to find ways of delivering healthcare more efficiently and improving the value as well. So we conduct a public consultation every year to develop our pricing framework. And through that, we were having stakeholders asking us to have a look more closely at the changes from virtual care models to ensure that they were being appropriately accounted for in our pricing models. So we engaged Nous Group to work with us on this project and to explore those issues in more detail.
That's great. So effectively, your stakeholders, they're the ones saying, hey, this is becoming more and more important for us and we need this advice and guidance from you. Okay, so what was the scope and what did you want to achieve to be able to answer those questions that your stakeholders had?
So we focused really on public hospitals. So we didn't really look more broadly at, say, private hospitals or other sectors. We did explore some boundary issues, where public hospitals might interface with aged care or primary care, but very much focused on public hospitals and looking for potential refinements that we might need to make to our data collections, costing standards and practices, classification systems, and potentially pricing models to support improved integration of virtual care into the national pricing model. We looked both nationally, so across all of Australia's states and territories, but also we looked at some international health systems that are similar to Australia to see if there were any examples there of funding arrangements that we could look at.
And those international models, did you find anything that was worthwhile going, oh, great, someone's done this before, cut and paste? Or was it a matter of, okay, that informs, but we're really going to have to develop something specific for Australia?
Yeah, there were some examples that were interesting, but I think it really demonstrated that countries all over the world are facing the same challenges and questions that we are, and there's no easy answer at this point.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, in your report, you had 5 key recommendations. To develop a national definition and taxonomy of virtual care was one of the first key recommendations in the report. And it's really confusing how these are defined. And they're not academic arguments. Like if you're running a health service, delivering a health service, making policies, that you really need to make sure people are on the same page. And your report has this really interesting graphic that shows common models of virtual care. So I know this is not a video medium and we will put a link so people can actually look at it themselves, but can you do your best to sort of describe those models that are depicted in that diagram?
So one of the challenges through this project was the vast number of services across Australia all have different names and slightly different tweaks on the way that they operate. That can make it really difficult to understand the actual underlying features of each model and the similarities and differences. So this diagram was to try and synthesize and categorize all of the models. So in the non-admitted setting, they identified models spanning outpatient telehealth consultations, chronic care management, often involving remote patient monitoring and multidisciplinary care models, care navigation, and virtual specialist care to other sectors, such as outreach to aged care or primary care. In the admitted setting, the identified models fell under 2 broad umbrellas, being hospital in the home services, and then virtual inpatient care, where the patient might be in a physical hospital bed, but their care is being supplemented through virtual modalities. And then finally, in the emergency setting, the models identified include condition-specific virtual emergency care, so models targeted to a particular condition, such as telestroke. We also looked at virtual emergency department services to consumers in their homes, and specialist emergency care, where there might be virtual consultations between clinicians across hospitals. So say a rural hospital seeking kind of specialist advice from an emergency doctor in a metropolitan hospital, for example. And I guess the diagram also captures the various modalities that are used across these models, whether they involve the patient or more clinician to clinician, and also flagging that there are both synchronous and asynchronous components of these models as well.
It's a really great model. So thank you and the report authors putting that together. I think you're on your way for the first recommendation to develop that national taxonomy and definition. I think that diagram actually is mostly the way there already. Now, one of the key challenges that people who work in healthcare would understand implicitly is around data capture. So not only do we have to define the services and scope them out and understand what we're talking about, but then how do we classify, count and cost virtual care and subsequently fund it, which is pretty much what you guys do, provide advice on that. So what did you find when it came to data, and what recommendations are in the report to address this challenge?
A really important finding of the project was that all of the in-scope public hospital models of virtual care that we looked at do have a funding model in place at the moment. So there are existing classifications that can be used to fund them. But the thing that we identified is that while there is a funding stream in place, often they're not visible in the data. So at the national level, we collect data on the types of care that's being provided to patients, both admitted, non-admitted and emergency as well. But that might include information on their diagnoses and health interventions. We have some information of how much time they spent in a hospital in the home model, for example, but we don't have data items that tell us whether they received patient monitoring or video conferencing or whatever else. And so that limits our understanding and what we can investigate at the national level and understand what's being delivered, number one, the volume of it, but then how does it compare across different patient cohorts receiving different types of care. So the first two recommendations were really around developing that national definition taxonomy for virtual care and using that to develop data items to improve the visibility of virtual care in national data collections, which would help to create a consistent, standardized evidence base to better capture all of those various dimensions of virtual care at a national level. So that helps from the activity perspective, but it would also be really helpful in enabling hospitals to conduct accurate costing practices for those patients. So for listeners who may not be aware, in Australia, we have a really fantastic hospital costing system whereby hospitals each year allocate all of their costs to individual patients according to the type of care that patient received. And that gives us really valuable data on the complexity and the types of care and the cost of that care. And if there's improved data capture of the virtual components of a patient's care, then the costs of delivering those virtual components should be able to be more accurately assigned to those patients. And so recommendations 3 and 4 are largely seeking to support improved hospital costing processes to ensure that those costs can be accurately reflected in our annual pricing determinations, and also to help with things like evaluation of services.
And I guess once those data capture decisions are made, then you need a way of actually capturing that data. And it's really pretty intensive work. There's a whole change in workflow to capture that data accurately, I gather.
Yes, and that's what we are really careful about. And the recommendations are kind of spanning a long period, is that we do want to make sure that we're getting them right, and the data that we decide to collect and put that effort into collecting will be valuable in future. So yes, it's very complex and a massive challenge, but it will be exciting if we are able to collect that data in future.
Oh no, I'm saying when, listeners to PulsePod are going to help you make this happen. I've told so many people about this report who wasn't aware of it and was like, okay, well, we've got to have you on the show, Julia, so we can amplify the message, because there really is so many people, thousands in Australia, who have been trying for many years to get telehealth up in whatever shape or form, even virtual first as appropriate. So to do that, there is a lot of this background work, almost like infrastructure, not physical infrastructure, but, all of this work that needs to happen in the background so that it can actually be done. And because if we're going to modify the business models of healthcare, well, we need to understand what does that mean, and making sure that we understand what we want to deliver and how, and then how that's costed, and of course, how it's funded. So it's such important work. Now, with your other recommendations, we've already discussed quite a few of them there, but, what else should listeners know about these recommendations? If they haven't read the report yet, what should they know? What would you say would be critical for shaping the future of virtual care?
The fifth recommendation in the report is around developing a pathway to facilitate the transition of service innovations into activity-based funding or alternative funding models that improve value. We have a couple of virtual care models that are currently block funded, and emergency department video conferences are an example of that. And so as these services continue to expand at quite a rapid pace, it will be important to develop and implement long-term funding models for them. In some cases, that could be activity-based funding, but there might also be opportunities for value-based funding models that might incorporate patient outcome measures or experience measures, for example. So if virtual care or a hybrid model can deliver better outcomes than standard in-person care, we might be able to recognise that in a funding model. But it would obviously need to be underpinned by improved data capture. And so that's kind of a longer-term recommendation, but certainly an exciting opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And so these recommendations, as I said, let's assume it's all happening. They're going to have impact on your stakeholders, which are public hospitals, certainly private providers as well, even though they're outside the scope of this particular piece of work, clinicians and patients. For those listeners who fall into one of those groups, is there anything that you'd like them to know?
I mean, for public hospitals, I think, as we mentioned, it's potentially some more work to collect data. And we know that that carries a administrative burden. And so we are very aware of that and trying to approach that in a very considered, strategic manner. But hopefully once we get that data, it should improve the way that funding is ultimately delivered in future. For private providers, I think, yes, while they weren't a focus of it, I think there are some more limitations faced by private providers in relation to virtual care. So in relation to, say, their Medicare benefit schedule rules, as well as the extent to which hospital in the home models can be utilised for private hospital care in Australia. And so I think the greater uptake and evidence base that will grow for public hospital services over time through these recommendations will support considerations for potential changes in the private system. And then I think for patients and clinicians, really, I'm hoping that the recommendations together will support successful virtual care models to be scaled nationally to improve access and equity for all Australians, and even potentially inform international developments, and ensuring that the funding is flexible and reflective of the cost of that delivery, and even providing access to those services gives a lot of patient benefits in terms of saving travel costs, convenience, and things like that. So I think there are a lot of benefits, and it'll be some work to get there, but we're on the right track.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Now, this next question I had for you was, as I said, highly recommend the report, but I would put myself in the inpatient category, not impatient as in a hospital, but impatient in I don't like waiting for things that are important. So for the impatient people like me and the cynics, your report has this roadmap, which is a 10-year time frame, which you said this is complex stuff, changing the health system. And these recommendations, if they're all implemented, do represent substantial changes. But is it really going to take that long, like 10 years, before virtual care becomes mainstream way of service delivery? And I know that's outside your scope. That's not part of your job description, is to make that happen. But we will talk to our friends, the Department of Health and Aged Care, about it. But any thoughts about why you feel that you can say about like this 10-year time frame, and what would be needed if we were going to do it in less?
I don't think it'll take 10 years for virtual care to become mainstream. I think, like, really critically, as I mentioned, we have those existing funding mechanisms in place for public hospital services. So that means that virtual care services that are being set up should, for the most part, be able to receive funding under the National Health Reform Agreement. And the existing classification systems and activity-based funding arrangements provide a reasonable level of flexibility to states and territories and also hospitals in terms of the types of virtual care modalities they can use, the composition of hybrid models or virtual care models, and how they construct those services. And a key theme from stakeholder consultations was that this needs to be integrated. They don't want separate whole funding streams because that makes it tricky to deliver it in an integrated way. So I think we're well on the way from that perspective. And I think Australia is a bit of a leader internationally on that front. I think as well, the implementation of block funding for emergency department video conference services in 2022 has also allowed for many states to set up these services and care for patients. And we still are unable to implement activity-based funding for that. But by putting that funding stream in place, the care is being able to be delivered and rolled out and scaled, while we still work on those data aspects in the background and work towards developing a funding model. So I don't think there's major barriers from a Commonwealth funding perspective for these. And so I think that points to the fact that these services will become mainstream quite quickly. And it's just, while the recommendations are over a 10-year period, they're very much focused on supporting specific refinements to the funding system over time, rather than kind of being a big bang, there is funding available now. And it's more about tweaking it and fine-tuning it so that over time it becomes more and more accurate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. All right. That's got a lot of promise. So following on from that, for providers and policymakers and health executives, are there any quick wins that could be adopted now or close to now?
I think one thing that we observed through the consultations is that while there's relative flexibility at the national level in terms of funding, a lot of the constraints can come from state and territory policy frameworks. So, for example, we observed that different states and territories have quite different policies and rules around hospital and the home models, and the extent to which virtual care can be used as part of those. So I think reviewing those policy frameworks at the hospital and state and territory level will be really important to ensure that virtual care can be delivered where it's appropriate. And the other thing is, while we talked about data collection and having those national consistency, hospitals and health services can still at the moment do work to collect that data, undertake costing processes to get a more accurate picture of how their service is performing. If services are able to conduct better patient costing practices now, that data starts flowing through to the national efficient price and the national efficient cost each year. So it can happen sooner than that 10-year period if hospitals are able to undertake that work. So I think they're probably the quick wins from my perspective.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds great. All right. So final question, Julia. In an ideal scenario, what are some of the immediate next steps that we could see from federal or state governments, or indeed other healthcare organisations, which will actually move the needle forward on virtual care?
So aside from doing that work to get national definitions and data collections, I think one thing which we've touched on a little bit is conducting evaluations, and particularly now having some of these models been in place for multiple years now, I think it's really critical to ensure that we're conducting robust evaluations, both to ensure that they are providing benefits relative to standard in-person care. But I think this will also be really critical for ensuring that these models can be shared and scaled nationally. So we have a lot of individual health services coming up and designing new models, but I think we're now at the stage where it'd be great to have them shared. So being able to share the design of those, share the challenges that have been overcome in setting them up, and share evaluation data that will enable broader uptake, promoting consistency, being able to seize on successful models and really utilise them, and also limit how much individual hospitals who aren't there yet have to do the work to innovate if someone's already done the work, and as we get more and more experience and knowledge and evidence nationally.
Oh, that's a great answer, because wherever your level of digital maturity or your services level of digital maturity is around virtual care, the point being is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, you really don't. You can save huge amounts of time and effort and looking at what's already done. And certainly, Pulse IT has been covering telehealth for, 15 years. There's lots of examples of people doing some really great work in this space, and they've evolved. So we don't need to start from scratch every single time and redesign it, which would also make your job easier, which means the funding models can move forward a lot faster.
Yes, that's correct.
All right, that's everyone's homework listening to this show. That's what you have to do, people, is go make that happen and make Julia's life easier, and then she can put together some recommendations for funding models. Now, Julia, thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's been really great to have you talk us through the virtual care report, and thank you and your colleagues at IHACPA for initiating this work and doing such a good job of it. And I look forward to seeing the next developments.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's been a great chat.
All right, George. Well, that was my interview with Julie. Again, sorry you couldn't make it, and sorry, potties, that you didn't get to hear George's dulcet tones during the interview with Julia. I think, George, it comes down to that governments are now taking telehealth or virtual care seriously, collecting data on it, making sure that we've got standardized nomenclature around it, that we're collecting data on as well, so that decisions can be made about how we price it appropriately. And that then becomes everyday healthcare, which is exciting.
Absolutely. I think at the end of the day, you need to talk to the people paying to make sure that they're on board with whatever we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Finally, George, did you have any recommendations for the Pulse Potties this week?
Look, I did. So I don't know if anyone remembers, but Loretta Swift, the actress who played Hot Lips Houlihan in the old TV series MASH, passed away during the week. Now, MASH was one of my favorite TV shows when I was very young. It came out in 1972, so I was still in high school when it came out. And I remember religiously 7 o'clock on a weeknight rushing down to watch Channel 10 to watch the MASH episodes. And my wife and I started watching them again from the beginning. She's a big MASH fan. So watching TV, which is almost 50 years old, is interesting. It's a medical show, so there is a medical angle there. But these are actually really good TV shows. So for those younger people who didn't get a chance to watch MASH, I would highly recommend watching the antics of Hawkeye Pierce and the MASH team for both entertainment value, but for a context of what the world was like during the Cold War, because the way things are happening nowadays, it may be something we need to get our heads around how people lived in those times of geopolitical turmoil. But I highly recommend getting back and watching old episodes of MASH.
I love it. Okay. I do remember it when I was little, but I was too little to really understand what was going on. But yes, okay, rewatching MASH. I will put that on my 2025 list of things to do, George.
We watched episodes that we'd seen probably half a dozen times beforehand and still rolling on the floor laughing. So from a comedic perspective, it's really good. But yeah, the underlying storyline based in the Korean War and the geopolitical politics and issues of equity, social isolation and issues of political turmoil and race, it's really a smart series.
All right then, MASH it is.
What about you, Louise? What can you recommend us?
Okay, well, I have a journal article. We talked before about ePatient Dave's Substack, where he documents examples of #patients use AI, which is excellent. Well, a new paper, which is published in JAMIA, the Journal of the American Medical Informatics Association, this paper documents how patients with brain tumours are using large language models to understand their clinical notes. It's co-authored by a friend of Pulse, Liz Selmy, so I will put a link to that in the show notes and suggest people check it out. It's open. You don't need to get behind a paywall. And it's really fascinating. Like I love seeing the doors that AI open to provide these windows into providing context and additional information to help understand what's in your clinical notes. I think it's a great thing.
Absolutely. And our good friend, ePatient Dave and Liz Salmi are obviously really driving that agenda around patient empowerment. AI is a great tool for patient empowerment if used properly. And again, part of the journey is to make sure we do it together.
Cool. All right then. Well, thanks everyone for listening. George, could you read us out, please?
Thank you for listening to Pulse, brought to you by Pulse IT News. Pulse is produced by Ivan Jurek of Octopod Productions. Big thanks to everyone for listening. Make sure you subscribe, follow, and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget, you can visit pulseit.news to sign up for the e-newsletter and explore Pulse IT's massive digital archive. Send any feedback or topic suggestions to pulsepod@pulseit.news. We love to hear what's on your mind. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, George. See you, everyone.